A very good evening to you and welcome to this evening's episode of The Watchdog. Local government elections will go ahead on Wednesday, the 27th of October. That's if the Independent Commission doesn't approach a court of law and ask for a postponement in line with recommendations they accepted following an inquiry that was led by Judge Dikgang Moseneke. The former Deputy Chief Justice recommended that this year's local government elections be postponed to February next year in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. Well, former Chief Electoral Officer and now member of the Commission, Mosotho Moepya, takes us through the next urgent steps that would have to be taken to avoid a constitutional impasse. After him, some of the leading political parties will give us their take on the government's decision to proclaim the 27th of October as the election date, as was previously announced by the president. And set to keep an eye on politicians whenever that election will have to be held is a group of organizations that this morning announced they have decided to club together to keep an eye on how political parties will fund their election campaigns. All of that coming up in tonight's episode of The Watchdog, which starts right now. Well, explaining the government's decision earlier, a few hours ago, the Minister of Cooperative Governance said the decision about what to do next now lies with the Independent Electoral Commission. Take a listen.
The people who must form an opinion whether the elections is going to be free and fair is the IEC. That's why it was the IEC that went and requested the judge to do the inquiry. It is in the electoral legislation that if they so wish, they could do that. So because the IEC has accepted the recommendations, it means it has accepted that the elections cannot be free and fair. If the elections cannot be free and fair, government cannot say elections must go ahead, even if they are not going to be free and fair.
What then will be the role of the government once the IEC goes to court and the courts decide on the matter? Here's what she had to say in an effort to answer that particular question.
The government will do what the courts say after the IEC has gone to court. But the proclamation of the date is so that there is a date that is proclaimed. When the IEC goes to court, it must say it's postponing the date that have been proclaimed for the 27th of October.
The Minister of Cooperative Governance also saying this is a situation that everybody is finding themselves in because of the unprecedented situation that not only South Africa but all of us around the world are finding themselves in at the moment.
All the issues that are being raised are intricacies that arise from this unprecedented situation, and we have to look at them. But the key for now is what the Constitutional Court will say, because we can't preempt and pretend as though the elections have already been postponed. The elections are not yet postponed until the court says so, that we must postpone the elections.
So what's it going to be? Well, we're now joined by former Chief Electoral Officer and now a member of the Commission, Mr. Mosotho Moepya, who takes us through the next steps, Mr. Moepya, that the IEC is now going to take.
Thank you, Vuyo, and good evening to your viewers. Ordinarily, and under normal circumstances, a proclamation has the effect of closing the voters' roll for further enrollment in relation to the election concerned. In this particular case, it means that the voters' roll, as we have it, by midnight today, will be the voters' roll whose segments will be used in the upcoming elections. It does mean that whenever people register, because people can register tomorrow, but those registrations that happen beyond midnight tonight, sorry, not midday, midnight tonight, will not be included in the voters' roll that will be used for the elections.
And that is going to be the case until, of course, the IEC decides to whether to go to court, and then on the back of whatever decision the court arrives at, we will take it from there. Let's talk now then about from tonight. The IEC took a decision. It was a unanimous one, we were told, to accept the recommendations of Judge Moseneke. You now then have to go to court and ask the court to postpone the elections as per the recommendations of the former Deputy Chief Justice. Is that correct?
It is correct, Vuyo. It is correct. In fact, let me hasten to say that I did say ordinarily this would happen. Normally, when a proclamation is also called, there will be a consultation that the Electoral Commission will have with political parties. That normally happens at, as close to the proclamation as possible. In this instance, and in keeping with transparency, ensuring that everyone is informed, we have had consultations already with political parties represented in the National Assembly on the election timetable that we would have to publish ourselves. We'll have to gazette an election timetable as a consequence of the proclamation. That consultation we've also had.
And what was the attitude of political parties?
Interesting. I thought you would ask that. I must say to you, all of the parties present indicated to us that they do not believe that that timetable is practical. In other words, they say in the current circumstances, a timetable would be okay. A timetable such as the one we had given them would be okay. But as things stand, they all said it is going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for them to comply.
We'll be speaking
So we have, for the first time, an election timetable that we've consulted with political parties, on which political parties have indicated to us for the first time that they do not believe the timetable is workable or one that is functional for their purposes.
Okay, we'll talk to some of them in a short while. Now, when then are you intending to file?
The plan is to file our papers tomorrow. They're just being finalized. I've had sight of the papers today, and I think they will be ready tomorrow for filing. At the absolute outside, we will file them on Thursday, but we are looking at tomorrow, all things being equal.
The Electoral Court or the Constitutional Court?
The Constitutional Court, absolutely.
Any particular reason for that? I think I can guess, but I'll leave it up to you to say it.
A number of reasons, Vuyo, very clearly. One is the agency and the time. If one has to escalate this, first in the Electoral Court, then perhaps in the Supreme Court of Appeal, and then the time is really of the essence. But secondly, whenever we go to a lower court, as we would normally under ordinary circumstances, such a decision would in any event have to be confirmed because the matters are of a constitutional nature. Those matters would have to be confirmed by the Constitutional Court itself. And you know, both the urgency and the nature of the relief we seek, we truly believe that it is the Constitutional Court that can grant that, the requests we have before the courts.
Now, what happens in the event the court looks at this matter and decides, no, we can't grant you the relief that you are seeking?
Very good question, Vuyo, and that is the part we will be explaining in part tomorrow when we have a briefing. But let me take this opportunity because it is a matter that is very crucial in the circumstances. We are approaching the court because we accept that an election on the 27th of October is most likely to result in an outcome or one that cannot be certified as being free and fair. This for a number of reasons. And that's why we go to court. We make that clear. We have just come out of alert level 4 in our lockdown environment. In that environment, and currently, political activity is very, very limited. In fact, it was non-existent in adjusted level 4. It is now limited in the current level. And you will recall that previously when we went to seek for an extension of the elections of the by-elections, we were at alert levels other than 1. We said other than alert level 1, it is very difficult for us and parties to do this work. We're currently sitting at alert level 3. Parties are saying, and we understand that, we see that, it's work that they need to do. When you do candidate nomination, you need to have meetings. In some wards, you'd have over 1,000 people and so on and so forth. And these are people that must elect a representative, a candidate. And so it is very difficult. But most importantly, an election is a culmination of a number of initiatives. It is not something that happens on election day. Candidates need to be campaigning. We need to have registered voters. We couldn't because of the third wave at its highest in the time that we had earmarked for registration on 2 occasions. And so we go into an election where there are many South African citizens who are used to the fact that there is normally a registration weekend. Not that it is legislated, but that we create those opportunities and they register and then they vote. You will see and you will note from previous registrations or elections that the registration weekend closest to election day is actually a significant one in terms of gaining new voters on the voters roll, and all of the changes or the updates to voter details happen in that registration weekend. All of that would have been missed if we were to go into an election on the 27th of October.
Now, we live in a very interesting country where things that many of us didn't think could happen only a couple of years ago are happening. In the event, the Constitutional Court doesn't grant you the relief you are seeking and says, go ahead and run an election. Are your systems, at least, putting aside for a second what, as part of the timetable, is the responsibility of political parties and all the rational arguments that are being made as to why this election can't be held now? Say, for whatever reason, the Constitutional Court decides otherwise. Are your system geared? In other words, can you still pull through an election?
Practically, or let me say technically, we are always ready to do an election, to conduct an election. We will, of course, we deal with a pandemic in this instance. If, for example, there was to be a the wave in one of the provinces would remain, as we have seen, and there are areas that are highly impacted, we would obviously see that effect in terms of the staff members that we employ, whether they would all be, healthy at the time, the availability of facilities from landlords. But other than that, technically ourselves, we are ready.
Mm-hmm. Quick last one, Mr. Mepa. Could you and COGTA and the portfolio committee in Parliament, and of course everyone else who has a stake in this, not have done this as soon as you adopted that report, gotten together, and then said, what are the scenarios here? So why don't we then do it before today, the day of the proclamation?
I think two things, Vuyo, that are important to note. In the first instance, we have a unique mandate that we are required to undertake from the Constitution, not even from national legislation. The Constitution clothes us with the duty to ensure that every election that we conduct is free and fair. That mandate is exclusively given to the Electoral Commission. So we have to make that call, and only us can make that call. We have made that call. Mm-hmm. We have very clearly indicated that the concerns raised, following the Moseneke inquiry, we accept to be valid, to be concerns that impact on the freeness and the fairness of an election. What did we do after that? We speedily moved to inform every stakeholder that we deal with. Our portfolio committee, we've had meetings with them last week. We briefed council, we consulted with the Minister of Cooperative Governance, as we are supposed to do. And so we have also briefed council. The papers are ready. This, as you would know, is not a case of this nature. It's not one which has precedence. There have been a lot of things we needed to negotiate, to understand, and to clarify. That we have now done, and we are ready to launch possibly tomorrow. 99% ready tomorrow. And so I don't think there's been any time that has elapsed that was wasted. It's been hard work until now. Maybe we have a breather once we have launched.
That's how we're going to leave it for now. Thanks very much for your time. Mosotho Mepa, who's of course the commissioner with the Independent Electoral Commission. After the break, we'll speak to some of the leading political parties to get their take on the government's decision to proclaim the 27th of October as the election date, subject, of course, to the IEC launching a court application, and, of course, subject also to what the court will say in the end. The Watchdog continues right after this. Local government elections will go ahead on Wednesday, the 27th of October, if the Independent Electoral Commission doesn't approach a court of law and ask for a postponement, in line with recommendations they accepted following an inquiry that was led by Judge Dikgang Moseneke. The former Deputy Chief Justice recommended that this year's local government elections be postponed to February next year in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. Well, we are now joined by two of the long list of political parties we have here in South Africa who are going to be affected by these developments. Fikile Mbalula is the ANC's head of elections, and Werner Horn is his DA counterpart. Gentlemen, good evening. Thanks very much for your time. As the commissioner just said, you were all consulted and all of you are agreeing. Mr. Mbalula?
Yes, thank you very much, and listeners, and thank you for having us. And we said in our submission, the ANC emphasized the importance of adhering to the constitutional injunction of holding regular and multi-party elections and the right of citizens to exercise their democratic right. So we agreed with the outcome and of the judge, but we are at the stage where, at the level of government and also the IEC, the matter is now being processed.
You were consulted. Apparently, there was a meeting today. Did you raise any other reasons or issues outside of the ones you have just mentioned that are obviously in line, like your constitution, the government's constitutional obligations, but also the situation we're finding ourselves in under COVID-19?
We support the postponement of the elections by not more than 6 months in order to allow for an evidence-based decision on the exact election date. So that has been our submission even today at the PLC level. We don't subscribe to the notion of postponing the elections altogether and synchronization of the election of local government and national election. That is a separate debate altogether. We believe that we need to go to elections and give the citizens the right to speak through the vote. And for anyone to stay in power more than whatever it is expected, I think that will be unconstitutional. So the ANC does support postponement, given the challenges we're facing of the pandemic and so on. And our time frame for that postponement has been February as presented to March, based on the possibility that at some point we could be facing the fourth wave of this pandemic.
Mr. Horn, your party's attitude?
Yeah, look, from our side, we placed it on record on numerous occasions that we feel that the constitutional obligation placed on the Commission is very clear, and that is to deliver the elections by the latest, the 1st of November this year. We at the time when the Commission decided to adopt the Moseneke report, made it clear that we will study the court papers of the IEC, which they now say will be filed tomorrow, latest Thursday, in order to then ascertain whether this is an application that effectively seeks to either amend the Constitution through an unlawful process or to undermine the Constitution. And based on the specific relief and the arguments forwarded by the Commission in the application, we will make up our minds whether we oppose or not. We still have the view that the election could have been ensured, as the law says, by the Commission on the 27th of October if specific milestones could have been reached by the Commission, even if they had to place themselves under some pressure. You had the interview with Mr. Mepwa just before we came on with you, and I must say that he is in one sense correct, in the sense that we were in agreement with other parties yesterday that the enforcement of the timetable pending the application is highly problematic from our point of view. We can understand that for an application to be brought, for an election to be postponed, the election must be formal, and therefore the proclamation makes sense. However, to require of parties to now submit all candidates lists by the 23rd of August for an election that could take place only in February, and whilst the Commission itself has failed to undertake other obligations it had in terms of the unpublished timetable, namely effective registration of voters, to our mind seems a bit unfair. I think it points to a situation where the Commission wants to prevent the court from now finding that the Commission is guilty of dereliction of duty, and that it failed to properly prepare. And ultimately, that's something the court obviously will look into very carefully, specifically the whole issue around the failure to have effective voter registration up to where we are sitting here today.
In what ways, more specifically, did they not do their work? Where were they tardy? What could they have done that they haven't been able to do up until now?
Well, you know, when the initial very rough draft timetable was circulated, the registration weekend was supposed to take place in June. Then it could not happen because the Commission would not have taken possession of the new voter management devices in time for that registration weekend. So then it was settled on the middle of July. The third wave arrived, and whilst one can have some sympathy with the Commission and the view they have that effective voter registration weekends should not take place amongst a level 4 and possibly even a level 3 lockdown situation. We must say that we find it strange that the Commission did not contemplate or let's say in all seriousness contemplate having a registration weekend this weekend or by the middle of August, and then truncating the rest of the timetable in order to show to the Constitutional Court that it, as it is, has made a serious attempt to attend to voter registration.
Mr. Mbalula, do you share the view of Mr. Horn that the Independent Electoral Commission could have done a lot better than it has actually done? Please unmute yourself.
No, we don't share that view. We believe that the Electoral Commission position is informed by the material conditions of one, there is a objective reality that we are faced with a pandemic, and the Electoral Commission, with our participation and everybody else, we have agreed on the Moseneke process, Judge Moseneke process, former judge. And then we are here now where we are. And the ANC will file submission supporting the IEC application to the court. And we know for a fact that we ourselves, like all political parties, were affected by the deadlines. That by the 23rd, in terms of the proclamation, we are required to have finalized the selection of all our candidates. And the IEC have followed up with this application to the Constitutional Court, which may turn differently, but we will have to support that. But for now, we are working strictly on what we know and in preparation for the election for the October 27th.
The ANC, Mr. Horn, says it's working on supporting the IEC in its application. You are adopting a wait-and-see attitude. It will all depend, as you just said, on what is contained in the affidavits that the IEC will be filing. But broadly speaking, I mean, they will be making a case in line with the recommendations of Judge Moseneke's inquiry. Do you foresee any? Do you see them departing from those?
Well, it's interesting that some parties within the liaison committee, and by names the ANC and the EFF, have advised the Commission to depart from the Moseneke advice in that it wants the Commission to apply for a postponement as far as April next year. So that's one of the things we will carefully look at. From our side, we are of the view that from of the different findings by the Moseneke report on which it based a recommendation for a postponement to February, voter registration is, practically speaking, despite the underlying reasons for the failure to have effective voter registration, a real concern. Some of the other grounds, however, in our assessment, is a bit tenuous in the sense that the scientific data and advice around whether we can have a fourth wave as late as January was there. Of course, Judge Moseneke placed huge emphasis on community immunity through vaccination, but then the reality still remained that in the run-up to a February election, we might sit with lockdowns, which will again prevent the type of political activity and hamper the effectiveness of political parties in the same way that Mr. Mbalula has just referred to now, and that was prevalent during the third wave. So in that sense, we want to see how much of a once-off and a final postponement is contemplated in the court papers. And if it is a once-off and a final postponement, we could possibly live with it, given the fact that voter registration has not taken place effectively. But then, of course, you referred to the Moseneke report. The one other thing we must remind ourselves is that whilst Judge Moseneke said, I find that a free and fair election cannot take place on 27 October, it can take place in February, but ultimately it's not my job to say how this must be achieved, and I leave it up to the courts to decide whether our constitution in any event allow for such a postponement to take place. And it's very interesting that only now, after the adoption of the Moseneke report, in the public discourse, there's a growing realization that there is a possibility that our constitutional court might come out and say, us being the ultimate protectors of the Constitution, we are duty-bound to say to the Commission, first go back and see whether you can still deliver an election before the 1st of November, because we can't just on a preemptive finding of an election not being free and fair, allow for a postponement absent of clear jurisdiction to that effect.
Has the ANC thought that far, Mr. Mbalula? What happens if the Constitutional Court takes a different view or is not as doesn't give the IEC the relief it seeks?
We have. That is why, in terms of our planning, we are moving from the premise that today there is a proclamation and that elections will take place in October. And from our point, we need about 3 months to campaign for everybody. And we think that the Constitutional Court must be allowed to apply its mind in all of this and come with a determination. If it does happen that they say we must get along and so on before, I mean, as it is suggested at the present moment, as the ANC, we are ready to go with that. But we will support the IEC in relation of postponement, as informed by the Moseneke Commission. We will support that.
Mr. Hon, is your party ready?
Yes, we're ready. We dealt with our candidate selections well enough in time for us to just now finalize the last internal administrative issues pertaining to candidate selection. So we will be able to meet the 23rd of August deadline to file candidates lists. We've done the necessary work to identify our supporters who must still register. So if a snap registration is ordered by the Constitutional Court, we're ready. Yes, I think it is not only constitutionally speaking, but also in terms of other considerations, the opportunity must now be given to the electorate to hold accountable those who served in councils over the last 5 years.
And that's where we're going to leave it this evening. Thanks to both of you gentlemen for coming through, Werner Hon and Fikile Mbalula, who had their respective parties' elections. And set to keep an eye on politicians whenever the election will have to be held is a group of organizations that this morning announced they have decided to club together to keep an eye on how political parties will fund their election campaigns. We'll speak to them in a moment. Don't go away. Well, a group of organizations announced today that they will be clubbing together and keep an eye on how political parties are funded. An important development, of course, on the back of legislation that was passed a few months ago, which is going to ensure transparency in the funding of political parties. We're now joined by Robin Pasense from the organization My Vote Counts, as well as Henny van Vieren from the organization Open Secrets. Good evening to both of you, and thanks very much for coming through. I'm going to start with you, Robin. Just how this initiative came about. How did you decide as the organization? I could see that the list is a bit long. How did you decide to come together to do what exactly?
Well, first of all, let me just say good evening to you and to the viewers at home, and thank you for having me on here this evening. Yeah, just to answer your question, I think you mentioned a little bit in your introduction. I think a lot of the impetus for starting the Coalition on Party Funding was that for so long, many people in civil society, My Vote Counts included, activists, other campaigners, have really been pushing on the point that we need a more accountable and transparent political space. And so through a lot of weight and advocacy and, of course, litigation behind getting the Political Party Funding Act in place. And the PPFA was enacted on the 1st of April this year. And now that we have this piece of legislation, we realized that there was a need to shift focus, in a sense, to make sure that now that this is here, we have this piece of legislation, that it can actually do what it sets out to do, which is to create that proper regulatory framework for party funding, but then also work alongside that as sort of mainly civil society organizations who want to make sure that information about party funding is accessible to the public, and that we work to create a kind of political culture that works for the people and not for kind of private interests or the kind of interest that will put the public lost.
Of course, I mean, it took a while to get the Political Party Funding Act to be approved and the president consenting to it in the end. One reason, I suppose, you guys felt the politicians can't be left alone. Yeah,
well, I think that's probably a very succinct summary of that. And it's not necessarily left alone. It's that we want to make sure that you are going to go forward and work kind of from the premise that your political decisions are going to have a real world effect on the people in South Africa, on the people that vote for you. And we seem to have a very long history with many examples where this has not always been the case. And we want to move forward now into a new kind of space where we don't have that kind of thing happening. And as you say, to get the PPFA sort of enacted in the first place took quite a lot of time and effort. And now that it's here, we have to make sure that it's going to work.
Of course, Henny, I mean, you guys have done a lot of work in this area. The whole phenomenon of, you know, people with big pockets, you know, buying politicians is a deeply entrenched one in South Africa, and it didn't start in 1994.
Voyo, good evening to the viewers. Absolutely, and I think, you know, to stress again, as Robin was saying, it's been the role of civil society and it's been the role of the media and investigators who've uncovered the practice of funding of political parties by elites, by corporations, by foreign governments. And as you say, this isn't something that just arrived with us in democracy. Certainly it has a history from apartheid, and we know from investigations that we and others have done in the late apartheid period that the National Party in itself was, the National Party regime was beholden to private interests. Naspers and others benefited greatly from the funding which they gave to the National Party. And I think it's very clear that mega contracts, important contracts like the establishment of Mnet were no doubt linked to the payment of funds to the National Party. And Voyo, I think what's interesting and important to note is that in its last years as the last years of white rule, the National Party went about setting up party funding vehicles, which today look exactly like the governing party, the ANC's Chancellor House, which is a fundraising vehicle. So we see a mirror in the kind of activity that we saw in the very corrupt later years of apartheid, really just bleeding into our democratic period. And I think very importantly, for a period of almost 25 years, almost all the major political parties in this country were very happy to maintain the status quo, which was absolute secrecy about who funds them, ensuring that the identities of those donors were kept secret. And that allowed our politics, I think we would argue, many in civil society would argue, and we've said this over and over again, to be corrupted. And of course, we have many different scandals and instances where we can see that foreign governments or very wealthy corporations or individuals have exerted influence over government decisions that have impacted the public, but have really skewed the decisions in the favor of these wealthy donors and elites.
And we've seen this throughout the world as well.
Well, absolutely. And I think the importance is that, again, our experience as a democracy isn't unique. And I think, Vuyo, it's important again to remind, the public to be reminded this wasn't an act of grace by the side of political parties who agreed to the Political Party Funding Act. They had to be dragged kicking and screaming into setting in place the laws that we as civil society now want to ensure are monitored in their implementation and are effective. But it's a practice, as you say, that's a commonplace in democracies around the world. In the United States is obviously a very good example of that, where many billions of rands were spent in the most recent United States elections. Big donors, plutocrats, wealthy billionaires and large corporations provide the money that greases those elections. And I think the argument as well is they've also allowed political parties to become addicted to this kind of, if you like, hot money, Vuyo. So the kind of cash that comes in quickly, instead of building a sustainable movement of people through branches. We know in South Africa, I think almost all political parties have become used to receiving from big donors. They don't go around trying to collect the small amounts of money from individual supporters and members, and therefore building an internal system of party democracy. But as we saw from the VBS Bank saga, which is linked to the EFF's funding, through to the African National Congress and the Democratic Alliance, who took money from the corrupt Gupta family. Those are all, just some of the many examples of parties that are very willing to do business with corrupt elites when it suits them. And I think that this undermines the practice of internal political party democracy. It's certainly been the impact in the United States, where the ordinary folk are kind of removed from the discussion, and it's big corporates that shift policy around. And I think that's our fear and our concern about what happens in South Africa as well.
Mm-hmm. And Robin, this is good, quick money. I mean, the rewards are enormous for people like your, Bosasas, your Gupta families, and those people. They only put this little in, but the rewards are go beyond sometimes even their wildest dreams.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just to latch on a bit to what Henny said there, what is so wonderfully illustrated is that what we're talking about, but this practice of elites in our politics, this, as you say, Henny, hot money, this easy money that can be made, this access to power and privilege, it really subverts the kind of ideal notion that we have of a democracy, which is that each and every person that lives in this country should have the right, the access, and the ability to have a say in the kind of decisions that affect their lives. And we are in this situation where you look at the easy ways of accessing, getting this money, and I think it becomes a very short hop and a skip from knowing that you can get that and then this taking over. And then we no longer actually have a political system. We don't have political parties that are beholden to people. And I think this is really the point where the coalition is trying to come in, is that we recognize the importance of legislation like the PPFA. We support it. But this is not the only thing that is going to kind of stem the tide of what we are talking about here and what Haley so beautifully put together in that kind of illustration there. So we need other moves by civil society activists, the public at large, where we are looking at this sort of money flows and saying that this really is the issue when it comes to you making political decisions that are going to either be to the betterment of our society or really its detriment. And I think that's where we need to be working.
Now, there may well be people or companies who decide to, not fund these organizations as the politicians fear. But we also know that there will be those who actually want to give them money precisely because of the benefits, the rewards that they may be able to reap. And because there's been a great deal of, there's been more transparency, which the Political Funding Act seeks to do, but also because there's been a great deal of agitation from, organizations like My Vote Counts and Corruption Watch and lots of others. They have become more skilled and more adept, isn't it, at hiding their tracks, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, Vuyo. I think we firstly do need to recognize that this Political Party Funding Act is indeed a victory for transparency. But there's no doubt that there is, as much as you put in place new laws, those who wish to subvert them are going to find ways to do that. What I think we should stress is that it's not that all funding of political parties, of course, is bad. We understand, though, that political parties do need funds to operate. We work for non-profit organizations and are transparent about the sources of our funding, and we would expect the same of our elected leaders and representatives. And so, there are mechanisms in place in the law, for example, a multi-party democracy fund where corporations and others can give money. That money is then allocated to various political parties. They don't even have, the point is, they don't have to give the political parties the money directly. But are there going to be attempts to subvert the system? Will there be attempts by foreign governments who are prohibited from now funding political parties, foreign corporations, and those type of entities? I think there's no doubt that they will, and that they will try and work through local fronts. As we know, these things, I think they can set these things up quite seamlessly. And that really is going to mean that the role of the Independent Electoral Commission is crucial. The role of civil society and the media and investigative journalists in continuing to expose it. The real lesson again, Vuyo, if we go back to the so-called established democracies, but we can use the United States as an example, where you in fact have a normalized system of corruption through party funding, where it is indeed an open secret. And so I think that needs constant challenging. And I think that that is the only way that you are going to ensure that you at least limit the damage. I think it's inevitable that there are going to be those that will continue to try and do the damage as much as they do. But I think very clearly what we need to see is not only the elements of exposure, but once the exposure happens, like in other instances of corruption and malfeasance, I think it needs to be very clear that we need to see sanctions that follow, and that's going to need prosecutions. And if that means that the heads of the political parties who accept those funds need to be prosecuted in the same way that the entities who are involved in funding them corruptly, whether those are CEOs of companies or individual members of organized criminal groups, they all need to be prosecuted. And so, I think the pressure is going to be on. It's not about having a really nice Rolls Royce to look at and shine up every now and then. It's about making this system work. And I think that sanctions and the enforcement of it are going to be key. And I think that is what we need to be pushing for in the next 5 to 10 years, no doubt.
Robin, very quickly, last question. We know that, this act was a subject of, went through various processes, negotiations, wheeling and dealing, compromises made, and so on. Are there still areas, or is there still an area that you feel wasn't covered or adequately covered in the act itself, which, as organizations that lobby and that are very active in this space, you'll be looking at next?
Yeah, I think absolutely. A lot of work had gone into drafting this, a lot of care and attention. So on that point, obviously, as we've been saying, very important. But I think to the point that Henny was just making here is that even if you have these things in place, there could still be those opportunists who are looking for those spaces to still kind of wiggle themselves in. And I think with that in mind, there are some spaces currently with how the PPFA is set up that there could be those spaces for that kind of opportunity. So on this point, it's something that My Vote Counts has said before. We think that the threshold amount for donations is too high. It's currently 100,000 Rand. That's a cumulative amount. There are other things that are not explicitly covered in the PPFA. So, for example, it does speak to donation in kind, but this excludes, for example, if I am an individual volunteer and I would like to volunteer, let's say, my professional services, I'm a lawyer, PR person, I can do that. That's not necessarily something that you would have to disclose. When it comes to investments or investment vehicles, that is also something that the PPFA does not yet speak to. So I think there are some spaces here within the PPFA that perhaps could be shored up. But again, the coalition and party funding is a long-term project. These are things that we are keeping in our view, and that these are things we will continue to create advocacy around.
Okay, that's where we're going to leave it. Thanks very much to both of you, Robin Pasensi, who is from My Vote Counts, and here Nifan Firen, who is from Open Secrets, two of several organizations that have clubbed together to make sure that they are going to make the Political Party Funding Act a reality, but also that they're mobilizing business, civil society, everybody to actually throw their efforts behind ensuring that the things that it needs to cover are indeed covered. Other organizations include the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation. They also include Corruption Watch, and they are asking everybody to join them. And that's why we're going to leave it this evening. Do join us again tomorrow evening, 8 o'clock sharp. For tonight, do have a good evening.